talk about the evolution of freedom. But before we do that, what I want to do is ask you just to sit back, in your chair, or maybe you're laying down, or whatever position you're in. Make yourself a bit comfortable, and then close your eyes. And then ask you the question, what does freedom mean to you? And just notice what's the first thought that comes up. It's not about, this is not about being intellectually correct or anything like that. Just see what's the first thought that comes up, and how does that feel, and how does that smell? Freedom for you? How maybe you can taste it, maybe there's a smell, maybe there's any association with it, and just notice what comes up. What does freedom mean to you? How does it smell? How does it feel? How does it taste? What does it look like for you? And then I ask you to open your eyes and just put a few words to the chat that relate to your experience here. Again, it doesn't have to be something that we can understand, just the first words that come up for you. What are they? And just write them in the chat. What does freedom mean to you? Just write a few notes in the chat. Okay, I'm going to read a few. Green grass with no sounds or drones or gunfire, just birds. Right. To do what I want, independence, safety to make my own choices, outdoor pine forests. I can choose what I want, what I do and when I do it. Right, breathing air, lightness, wonder. Empowers me to explore value systems with joy and care, not being prevented by others. Warm grass, sunlight, laughter. The assurance that I will be able to pursue my callings without being suddenly or arbitrarily cut from this. It smells like wet green grass. Great. So great. And it's, one thing I notice here, which doesn't surprise me because I think this is an experience that a lot of people have, is that so for you, if I formulate this freedom, it is something that you move towards. It's something that you move towards too. And so if I look at myself, the relationship that I have with freedom, um, the there's you could say there's three parts of my life that are important in that. I was born after the Second World War in '63. I'm still part of the boomer generation, so there was lots of stories around the Second World War, how freedom was restricted, but also lots of stories about how important it was that we had our freedom, that we could live in a democratic world with my parents. And I grew up in this meme in the Netherlands, which you probably would point at, as seeing quite left-wing, progressive, green values, blue values, green values. where there was a lot of awareness about what was going on in the world when it comes to the Vietnam War. You know, it was a time that there was an arms race, so we were fighting, we were protesting against nuclear weapons. There was a lot going on in Central America by the CIA that we were fighting against, and it was about, you know, the freedom in South Africa. That was one side of the story, and a lot of my friends, you know, were leaning towards communism. But at the same time, in that period of time, I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, in Poland, before the change was there. And so for me, I had this connection with authoritarianism there, and I saw, you know, saw with my eyes what it was to live there, and how my friends there were limited compared to how I lived in the Netherlands. So both of these items were very present for me. I traveled a lot in China. You know, after the Tiananmen Square, and so there was this sense of, you know, seeing our freedom, seeing the limits of what the West was doing, and but at the same time seeing, you know, what authoritarianism can do to people. And so for me, that whole mixture has been something that has shaped how I look at freedom, but also, you know, why it's important to me and why I keep exploring it. So if I look at your responses, if I ask you what is freedom, there is, you know, this is what Ishai Berlin called positive freedom, or you could say freedom too. So you're telling me that, you know, there's something that provides you with freedom, something to move towards through, you know, so your own agency, your own you know, freedom to make choices in your life, freedom and so Isaac Berlin talked about this is, you know, this is about mastering your own life, freedom to act upon one's will, basically, to the degree to which both individuals and groups can act autonomously. So if you look at that sort of freedom, we see that that is actually quite new in if, you know, if we look through the spiral how humanity evolved, we see that that's actually something that started to emerge in the democratic countries, and maybe mostly in social democracy. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. So that's where a lot of that was experienced. Right. At the same time, we saw that there were limits to that, as I showed in my own sort of experience with freedom. Um, Berlin also identified what he called negative freedom, which is freedom from. And that is, you know, where freedom is obtained by removing barriers. So, you know, if you're being enslaved, you fight against those that enslave you. So then you have to fight against something. You know, fighting against an invading force, anything to do to not be enslaved, basically, and the barriers you need to remove to not be enslaved. He called it negative freedom. I you know, I don't really like those terms, so came up with two different sets of terms. You could say the freedom from is something. You could also call it a basic freedom. You know, so that's like, it's like the first sort of thing you need to be away from change. And then the positive freedom can be called complex freedom because it is something that only works in more complex structures. It's not just you not being enslaved, but it is you having access to all sorts of facilities that provide you to shape your own life. Because, you know, your choice of profession can't be done without schooling, can't be done without an whole infrastructure of people and social structures to allow you to make those choices. There's another term I came up with, and, you know, you can create your own terms. You could also say that, you know, the negative freedom, the freedom from, is an individual freedom. So it's this thing for me to be free, and then this freedom to do something, to create something, is a collective freedom because we need these whole social structures to create that. And so while in the, you know, we'll talk a lot about positive freedom in this in tonight, but I think both of them are important, but both of them have different places in you know, when they are important, when they need to be applied, and and you could say that, the positive freedom needs the negative freedom, needs the freedom from, as a prerequisite before it can form. We see that, the freedom from and the freedom to, we do see a lot in our political discourse. And we see, in populist politics, I see a lot of, freedom from, freedom from immigrant, freedom from whoever is threatening us. There's also this form of, an extreme form of libertarianism is about, me as an individual being totally free from the state. And I would say that's also a very individual form of freedom and not necessarily a very collective one. So this is one lens that we will be using tonight to go through. Then Timothy Snyder wrote this book on freedom, I really loved it, and it's also the thing that got me to do this presentation. He talks about what freedom in a complex world means, and so he talks about 5 forms of freedom that lead to what Isaac Berlin would call positive freedom. So these are, the sovereignty, the agency, the mobility, factuality, and solidarity. There are actually 5 layers, he says, need to be present for a person to be free, in the way that, if you define freedom in a similar way that all of you talked about it, when you're saying, you want the freedom to choose things, you want the freedom to move around, you want the freedom to make choices in your life. To do that in our current world, basically, in our complex society, these 5 layers are required. And Timothy Snyder wrote that book also, looking at the developments in the US. It's a book from 2018. So he takes into account also, what's happened after Trump took office in his first term. And he's specialized in Eastern Europe. Like me, he spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe in the 80s. And so that also formed his ideas about freedom. He saw what it was to live in those conditions. He's compared that to how he lived in the US. And so this is basically what he talks about. So we will use these layers, but we will, the next thing that we will do is we will also, primarily use the spiral lens to look at freedom as well. So what I'm going to do is use this spiral lens, look at how human development, how we've grown from less complex to more complex societies, what freedom means at each of these layers, and then I'm going to bring in the work of Snyder as well, to a lesser extent the work of, we also look at the work of Berlin, and then we'll look at that from each of these layers. Right? And we're going to go through the layers up to including green. So because the reason I've done that is because if we look in our world, in our countries, most of our countries, we have these first value systems. Beige, of course, it's before language, so we're not addressing that, but beige is always there. We're going to go through these 5 layers because that's what's present in our current world. Our societies are being ruled by these 5 value systems. And I see our session tonight, us meeting and talking about this and exchanging ideas about it, and actually looking at it through the spiral lens as the yellow way of looking at freedom. And I'll address that at the end of my presentation. But we don't have a yellow society yet that we can analyze when it comes to these forms of freedom, but we certainly will look at what freedom means from a yellow lens. So let's step through this, right? So we're going to use those different lenses. And we're starting at purple, of course. Beige underneath it is basically, beige is where we have the basis where we can, we have food, we have shelter, we can live, we can reproduce, that's it. It's a pre-language phase, so that's not really anything to look for in terms of freedom. But in purple, we can start, right? And then, so what I do here is I look at the pure form of those value systems, right? And in purple, that is tribal life, right? It contains it creates a container for human survival, and the focus in that container is the tribe, and everything that's happening is part of the is focused on survival of that tribe. So in itself, there's tribes out there that don't even have the word for me of I. So the existence in purple is focused totally on collective survival, basically. So there's not a, you could say, if you want to talk about freedom in that, it's the freedom to exist, as a tribe, not as an individual so much. Then we can look at each of these layers, they contribute to our current world. And then I'm talking about a world that has developed to at least including orange and some green, right? So or of course in every world it's included, but if you look at the lens through to Western societies that have developed orange and that have developed green, then we can look back at purple and say, what does that provide in our current world? And then I'm going to link to the work of Snyder, because Snyder says the first layer is sovereignty. And that very much connects to the spiral layer, where sovereignty is to control your own body, health, and basic existence. So basically, the purple layer in our society nurtures our humans and our children so that they can grow up to be autonomous human beings, and that they can decide what to do with their own bodies, that they can make choices. That's actually a further layer, but that they have the ability to belong to themselves. Snyder uses the word Leib, which comes from German, which is a word for life. But it's a word that it's more than just being alive biologically. It's about being alive as a human being in this world. So sovereignty is a first layer to be an autonomous human being, basically. Then we can look at each of these layers. If it gets applied in an unhealthy form in our complex societies, what sort of deformation does it give, right? And then the purple layer, if in its pure form is taken to its extreme in our current society, we see that freedom means the freedom of my people and not yours. So my focus is completely on my tribe, and outside that, I don't really value human life, basically. It's not allowing the others a right to exist. We don't necessarily need to fight them, but all my energy into life is about my tribe and not your tribe. So if we see that in a positive way, the positive part that it contributes to in our society is a healthy bonding, making us feel secure and provide the possibilities of functioning as a sovereign individual, right? So this is where I, as an individual, can exist, and my environment provides me, the basics to grow up as a healthy individual human being. If we take the purple ID that it's my tribe and not your tribe more to the extreme, and we add a little bit of red layer, that we'll talk about that later, it is about my people first. So and my people is often, identified. It can be identified as a national, like the Germans, the Dutch, the Americans. But it's often, when it does that, it's often also identified as race. Right. So when there's a Dutch political party and says, the Dutch first, they don't mean the Dutch that have the Dutch people that have a darker color of skin. They mean, the white skins, preferably blonde, sort of, Dutch people that believe that they've always lived here all their lives. Most of them are actually immigrants at some stage in our life, but that doesn't matter. For some of it, it's a long time ago. For others, it's not. But this is, and we see this happening everywhere in our current world, in the Western world at least, right? So America for the Americans, but that doesn't even include Black Americans that have lived in America for 200 years, right? In France, it's very much aimed against African immigrants. In Germany, it's against all immigrants, and we see this through history. right? So, and also at this layer, we do see that there are certain idealism creates stories around this. We'll come back to that. So the next layer, in spiral, the red layer, this is where, if we look at the pure form of that, that's when the empires ruled in the world, right? And you wouldn't choose a green values leader at that time. If you lived on the plains of Asia back in, 1500 years ago, you wouldn't choose a a Bernie Sanders as your leader. Right? You would choose somebody that, that has this energy to say, we're going to go for the kill. We're going to go because if you would lose the war, your people get enslaved by the others. Right? Remember this, underneath this is the purple tribal. So in red, if you also look at the history, um, everybody was enslaving everybody. The Vikings were coming down from the north through what is now Ukraine and the south, and they were enslaving people. But it was happening all over the world from this value system, right? There is an interesting part in that because you see these empires being built from this mindset where they have these absolute rulers that rule with iron fist. But you see, remember, if the world is a dangerous place with only these empires, you want to follow that leader because that's safety. But there's also the Robin Hood type in there that fights for the freedom of his or her people, right? Or the Joan of Arc and so on. So you have these freedom fighters, often coming from the same sort of value system. This is in the spiral we say this is the bird of the ego, and so if you look then at what that layer contributes to our current world, and we go back to the work of Snyder, he talks about agency. So as a human, to be free in our current world, in our complex world again, we have the ability to act in our own interests. We have the ability to go out there. And what I really like about his work, he talks about this word unpredictability. So the space to be unpredictable. I can either go and live there, or I can live there. I can take that job, or I can this job. So this is where he talks about the ability of the individual to make their own choices. Right. There's a lot more necessary for that. And it's interesting because, if we then look at the deformation of this value system in our current world, we see that there's quite a lot of politics out there today that is defining the freedom of our Western countries as being free from something. So Trump talks about being free from immigrants. We have in the Netherlands we have Geert Wilders. He talks about being free from immigrants, but also specifically from the Islam. So he has defined a number of um, groups of people, basically, which clearly are not the white-skinned Dutch people. That if we only move them away, all our problems go away. And that sort of politics, because it is in the spiral level, it's actually quite a simplistic world. It's a world of the world is a chaos, and it takes a strong person to rule that chaos. So just like in some that's why people follow on Trump or follow a Putin or follow a Geert Wilders, because they have a simple story about how they can regain freedom from these people, right? And this is interesting because freedom is the Geert Wilders has this party called the Party for the Freedom, right? And but this is where his version of freedom is very much in line with this purple red model, where it's my people, they're free if those other people go away, right? And it's not so much about democracy and things like that. So it's and then there's the paradox in this, because where Snyder talks about the agency allowing us to have this to be unpredictable. If you live in a empire that is ruled by a red leader, that leader makes things very predictable. They make sure that everybody follow their rules, and that they're part of their tribe, right? If you look at Saddam Hussein in Iraq, there were basically the two major tribes there his tribe, those were the people in power, and the others were being prosecuted or killed or whatever, right? So it's and in this, what often happens here is that in this desire to rule, the rulers create a story about us being better than other people, right? So it's and if you look at Donald Trump, if you I mean, there's not a lot of ideology behind it, but if you listen to some of his speeches, he clearly does think that, that his sort of blood type is better than other blood types. Similarly to, and I'm not comparing him in all his deeds with that, but Hitler had the same story, right? It was about the Übermensch, about the Aryan being the model of humanity. And we don't hear a lot about Putin's ideology, but if you look at the philosophers that Putin follows, those are people that define the Russians as being better human beings than other human beings. And one of the, Ilyin writes about how the Russians have this unique capacity to channel cosmic energy. Right? So there's often these purple stories underneath it, right? That justify this. And in that, it often creates an alternative reality. And the interesting thing is, within this meme, if this is our world, it doesn't really matter that we have an alternative reality, because the power of our empire is it will exist as long as we all believe that story that the leader tells us, and we follow that leader. We, as an empire or as a people, will survive, right? But that works well in a world that is only ruled by empires. If we have a world that's in which we have, sovereign nations and things like that, things become more complex. So agency is our ability to take care of ourselves, to make our choices and to shape our lives. And then, of course, if we go to the unhealthy part of it, you could say this is a negative part of the red expression of freedom. It's about us versus them. It's dehumanization. And there is an irony with the word freedom in that, because that the freedom is following, doing what the leader tells you to do. Above the concentration camps, they had this phrase "Arbeit macht frei," uh, and it's so labor makes free, for those of you that don't speak German. And so that's what the prisoners read, right? So but it wasn't put there, or it was put there in all earnest, right? It was the people that put it there really believed that they were, as them being superhuman beings, or superior human beings. The other people, the ones that they enslaved, they should serve them, basically. So that's the irony of that. And I just want to note here, right? It's not because, so if we, as humans, when we live through this lens, it's not that we're necessarily bad people compared to anybody else in this world. It's just this is a certain way of looking at the world. And if you see the world as a chaos in which the strong survive, this makes sense, right? But as most of us sitting here will see the world quite differently. And then, of course, different items come to play with that. This is This is Diana Loginova and Alexander Orlov, who a few weeks ago were playing a song that was critical of Putin in St. Petersburg, and they got arrested, right? And this is a typical dynamic we see from we're from a position where we are an empire and the leader determines the truth. As long as we follow that truth, we have freedom of movement within that empire. But if we don't follow that, then our freedom gets restricted, and they got jailed and freed and then jailed again, right? So that's how. But that's a red way of looking at the world, right? Okay, so then we move to the next layer. And so with blue, in its pure form, we start to create nation states, cities are built. We create order and structure through social systems. So the unwritten laws of purple become written laws, and there's a book of truth, and it's often connected to either a religion or an ideology, right? So Catholicism, Islam, communism, socialism, they're all blue truths. If we, as long as, and what they all have in common is that they believe that the whole world should look through their lens. This is, they have a truth about how life is should be, a truth about how life came to be, and if and they create social structures, laws and regulations and institutions. There's a court. We also see, that people, rather than being farmers and doing everything, we start to get, specialize in certain skills. We become bakers or carpenters or whatever it is, and the it creates a certain order where the red world was a constant chaos of the empires fighting. Blue creates a order and structure. And although blue may think that the whole world needs to look through its lens, and there's plenty of wars being fought from that perspective, blue, because it also respects rules and regulations, starts to have the ability to create a rule-based order in the world. So my nation can create an agreement with another nation not to attack each other. And this is a really important part. And of course, if we, history is messy and all sorts of value systems played at all sorts of times. No, history didn't go through these value systems neatly step by step. But it's really important to see that once this came into being, we started to get out of this idea about my tribe, and we started to get into this idea about an order-based world. The interesting thing that I found, studying some of the history of Central Asia, is that once the blue started to come in through the religion, we didn't enslave our own religion anymore. So there may be two nations, and they may go to war. There may be both Christian nations still go to war, but if one of them conquers the other, they don't enslave the people because they're part of my truth, they're part of my religion. So they get incorporated in my country. The Roman Empire, it of course it also enslaved, but it also made lots of tribes that it conquered part of its own empire. If you complied with the rules, there was lots of opportunities to also become part of the empire. It's a messy, not every emperor did that, and there's a messy history there, but you can see a change in mindset there. And that's really important to remember when we also go on further. So what Snyder talks about is that the next layer adds mobility. And now, if you've grown up in a very strict sort of, restrictive blue environment like Eastern Germany before the change before 1990, it didn't feel like there was a lot of mobility. But you have to realize that within those systems, within those countries that define a certain set of rules, there is an ability to be mobile within that country, within that truth. Right. So, and this is where the sovereignty of nations created, and so the blue layer creates the ability. In our complex model, again looking through the complex lens, we see that blue, by creating all sorts of structures, it makes sure that everybody has food, has water, there's hygiene, there's healthcare, there's parks, there's roads, and all of that provides us with the mobility that is necessary for our individual freedom. It also, in the more complex world, provides us with a reasonably fair system of laws that allow me to fight for my freedom if I feel that somehow I get restricted. Right? But then we have to have complexer complex values as well, right? But the sovereignty of a nation is really important there. Right? Now, if this system gets unhealthy, then it's, then the one rule gets very suppressive, very restrictive. This is the former DDR, former Eastern Europe. The state was watching everybody, and if you did anything wrong, you were picked up, you went to jail, you became an enemy of the state, and that worked. It worked the same way, to maybe to a lesser extent in countries like Poland and also in the Soviet Union, of course, between the Second World War and 1990, when this whole change came. If we look through the lens in our current society, we do see, blue values-driven politicians are often not very open to migration, right? So, and it's not necessarily because they see those, the other people as not human, or because they have anything against them. It's more about maintaining the status quo. It's more about having a conservative view on life. But this is really important. Blue provides the structure for humans to create social order, free movement, security, and access to education, healthcare, and food. Right. So this is so key in when we analyze our world. We'll come back to that. Yeah. So the deformation is doctrines. Only one truth. Can be strict religious doctrines, can be strict social, communism worked really well if the whole world will be communist, right, or socialist. And obviously there's a lot to say about that as well, because I'm sure that Marx and Engels had different ideas than the way that it was eventually implemented in the Soviet Union and other countries. But it's good to recognize that blue has this tendency to go into doctrines which are unhealthy for. Good. I want to ask you again, if you don't mind, to close your eyes for a moment and to imagine that you are a Ukrainian soldier, and that you've been fighting and you've been captured by the Russians, and for 50 months you were locked up, you were tortured, you were hungry because they didn't feed you enough, you were humiliated in all sorts of ways. And then they take you from your prison cell, they shove you in a bus, and through a prison exchange, they ship you off to Ukraine. So this is a bus of those soldiers, and let me see if I can remember his name, because I didn't write it down. But this young soldier has gone through that experience that I just described, and now he's in the bus back to his homeland.
Ой, у лузі червона калина похилилася, чогось наша славна Україна зажурилася, а ми тую червону калину підіймемо, а ми нашу славну Україну гей-гей розвеселимо. Ой, у лузі.
So he's singing a song, Trevona Kalina, and which is a freedom song that's been used in Ukrainian history, and it's a symbol to fight for sovereign Ukraine. And I just, for a moment want you to connect this, because I think most of us, as we sit here, we've grown up in a world where the freedom was there when we were born. right? So we are, especially of all of you that live in a democratic country, we haven't gone through an experience. Maybe some of you have, but I think most of us haven't gone through the experience. Dennis's name was that Dennis has gone through, and so for him, the sovereignty of Ukraine and the ability to see that as a homeland and to fight for that and to go back to that is a very that's an experience that I think most of us will never have in our life. I hope so. But it's very important to realize that it is part of the layer that our current freedom is built on. Right? This song that he's singing is forbidden in Russia, and as our other national songs, also the occupied areas that Russia has occupied from Ukraine, these songs are forbidden because they don't want Ukrainians to feel Ukraine. They want them to feel Russian. Right? But this, so, in one way, we've seen, in those of you that lived in the West, we've seen nationalism being abused. But nationalism also has a quality, and it's a quality of our country to be free. It's a container. It's not everything that we need, and if we get too nationalistic, there's all sorts of pitfalls in that as well. But there's a quality in that, and that is for people, for sovereign nations to make choices to determine their own future best. And that brings us to the next form of, the next layer in the spiral. Because it's only in orange that countries start to develop democracy, where, going away from the dogmas of blue, we move to seeing, I love this phrase. Don used it a lot. Where, why should I wait to have a happy life later in heaven if I can have a happy life now on earth, basically? And that's what that's the individual freedom that orange brings to our lives, which is so, for most of us, is such a given, such a normal thing, right? But it's the freedom to be to determine your own future. It is also in orange we start to try to understand life, right? Science and technology emerges as not driven by the church, but driven by a real desire to be truthful. When Columbus wanted to travel the world and had enough science understanding to understand the world was round, the church would argue that wasn't true, right? The church had a big say in the Middle Ages in Europe into what was true and what was not true. Today, there's still a lot of people that there's still some people that believe the Earth is flat, but there's not everybody that is religious would believe that there's been the theory of evolution. But our societies, our Western societies, are dominated by understanding how human life developed. Spiral dynamics is part of that, of course, but science and technology is part of that. And it's where it's so important that we what Orange does is creates a shared understanding of what life is about. And that's a very important part of freedom, because if we can go out there and investigate things, think about investigative journalists. We can uncover things that are not right in our society, and we're in a true democratic society. We are allowed to speak up. There's laws and rules and regulations that allow us to speak up for what we think is true, even if we are wrong, right? So it's the right to free speech. So we, in a free society, we allow people to say that the Earth is flat. We allow people to say that Darwin was wrong, even though we may believe that's not the case. Right? And that's what Orange brings. And so what Snyder talks about is what Orange brings into our stack of requirement for freedom is factuality. So to have a shared sense of reality, we need facts to make informed decisions, he says, to be unpredictable. Remember, unpredictable, this freedom to move, the agency of red. Here, we need to know about our world to do that and to make those choices, right? Truth gives citizens the power to understand their world and hold leaders accountable and act meaningful in public life, right? This is so normal for most of us that I think it's really good to really, for a moment, reflect on this and see that in the history of the world, this is not a very common thing. Most of humans that lived, or I should say, most of the time that people lived, that this wasn't there, right? This is only coming to being in the last 300 years, maybe. A shared sense of reality, the right to facts, is an important part of that. So how does that deform, right? Once we have this, we have a democratic society, how can we not be free? Well, we can be, because each of these layers has an unhealthy form as well. And one of the things that we see happening in our Western countries a lot in last decades is that there is this religious belief in a free market. There's a religious belief that I can take care of myself, you can take care of yourself. Now, to a certain extent, you can say, a little bit of that thinking helps people to get out of their chair and do things and so on. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we take that idea to this extreme, we start to destroy the underlying layers of social structures, rules and regulations for corporations, social systems that help people that somehow don't have the ability themselves to go out there and earn an income, because you're disabled, because whatever situation you're in. Right? So if we let that system run without control, we create this world that is ruled by corporations, where everything is about the bottom line, where everything is about the value of money and not about the value of humans. And then the red systems from the red value system view, the empires, they had an extreme difference between the haves and the have-nots. If you look at current day Russia, there is an extreme difference between the poor people and the rich people. And there's lots and lots and lots of poor people, and there's very few rich people, and there's this very small middle class. Now, in the blue system, that starts to change, and the orange system, when it comes into being, starts to create a welfare where that changes more. But if we then let the system go unhealthy, then we see that the orange system starts to, when it starts to take away the blue layer underneath orange, and everything becomes about corporate profit, then again, this extreme division between the haves and the have-nots, not as bad as under the red system, but still, and that's what we see in many of our Western countries, but specifically in the US at the moment, where we see a large poor class emerging, a lot of homelessness, and a lot of that is about taking away basic social systems, food stamps and all, healthcare and things like that. So orange is such an important layer for the freedom that you all talked about, the factuality, and I love this phrase, speaking truth to power. This is so important that we can actually go and say we don't agree with this. One of the really important moments in Ukraine history was a couple of months ago when Zelensky passed a law to stop some of the anti-corruption agencies, and people went onto the street even though there was wartime and even though they had lots of other priorities. But for them, they recognized that if there was no longer an entity that could investigate corruption, that would take them back into the ages of red values ruling, basically. And so to defend their democracy, people went onto the streets and they spoke their truth to power, and power responded to that. Now, there's lots of nuances in there, and there's lots of ways you can look at that. And Ukraine is a very young democracy. You can't compare it to the democracies that have lasted for hundreds of years in Western Europe or in the US or in Canada or New Zealand or Australia. But still, for its young democracy was a very defining moment. Because the anti-corruption agencies, they investigate. So they create a shared sense of reality, right? We don't have to believe the story of the oligarchs anymore. We can see for ourselves what is true and what is not true, right? And when Orange gets negative, when Orange gets unhealthy, you could say, you see that, I talked about this free market dogma, breakdown of social structures, the business before human rights. There's this book by David Friedman, the machinery of freedom, in which he basically, he wants to outsource, he wants to incorporate every aspect of society, including the police force. So you have to sign up with a certain police force, and obviously that takes away all of the blue layers, the layers of the social layers that blue has created in society, and relates them with one truth and one truth only, and that is the free market rules. And I love the way that Snyder talks about that. He says, because when there's only one truth, which is the free market rules, we go back to being very predictable. And we want to be unpredictable. We want to have the freedom to follow different ideas and different definitions of freedom and different ideologies in a society. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but if you're a Pink Floyd fan, you may know the song "A Great Day for Freedom," in which they were singing about, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which gave a lot of people access to that democratic freedom. But it also, in that same moment of time, we also saw that, the Friedman forces in this world were telling the Soviets, for instance, to abandon all the social structures that were there in favor of just a free market. And it created enormous amount of poverty there. So, people were, they looked at the West and I thought, oh, it's going to be so great having democracy there. But without the social layer and without all the structures that democracy requires to function, and, people having the jobs and the corporations to be there, taking away that social layer actually let the societies collapse into red chaos rather than progress to orange systems. And many of the Eastern European nations have gone out of that. They have fought themselves out of it. But unfortunately, in Russia, we've seen that it hasn't been able to create enough blue structure there to actually build upon a layer of democracy and the freedom as many people may value that. And then that doesn't mean there's lots of people in Russia that are driven by orange and green values and yellow values that want that. But in social structure, it is simply not there. And that's what Pink Floyd also sings about in this song. Okay, then we go to the last layer that we see in our Western societies or in the world at large. And that is the green. Green comes in and says, great that we have an individual freedom, but we need to take care of each other as well. So green sees that, orange has become heartless, focused only on individual freedom, and it starts to fight for freedom, not only for the majority, which is what democracy does, right? But also for the minorities. You can say, democracy is two wolves and a lamb having a vote on what's to eat for breakfast, right? So, and what green adds to that is the voice of the lamb, right? So to be decisive if the wolves would vote against the interests of the lamb. So it means that, lots of work is being done by Amnesty International, Greenpeace, and so on, organizations to bring attention to the well-being of ourselves, to minority groups that may not that somehow get left behind in that democratic model. And it creates, you could say it creates a social democracies. So if it in its healthy form, in its unhealthy, or it is for the first form, it just throws out everything, which is, the hippies were against every structure and anything like that, and they wanted just freedom for everybody, right? But when green is built on healthy orange, it creates social democracies. So a good social care system where it also allows the blue layer to be there, and it allows the orange layer to be there as well. So Snyder talks about this layer. He talks about solidarity. He says in order for freedom to work, but there has to be solidarity. I have to allow you to be free, and you have to allow me to be free. And again, this is more complex, right? Because what you may want, may not be what I want, and then we need to negotiate or mediate or find a way for both of us to get what we want. And you could say this is a process which is still under development. I'm not even sure that green can fully do this because if we look at current world, green has done a lot of repair of what's gone sour in the whole spiral, but it's also struggling to a certain extent. We'll talk about that. But solidarity is key to freedom. If we talk about freedom to do something, so if you want to have freedom of choice for your kids in their education, you have to have a social structure that allows everybody, this, independent of their income, to study. It means that you need universal healthcare for everybody. It means that you need a system where the roads are there to make sure that you can get from A to B. The train system is there. The court system is there for you to fight for the freedom that you may need if somehow somebody limits that. Right? If your neighbor starts to take part of your garden, right, and you can go to court to take that part back. So you may look at that as being petty, but it's the fact that that system is there is an important part why we have a certain structured way of living in a large part of the world. Right? I like what Snyder said, voting is applied solidarity. So then we go, we vote and we accept that our party loses and your party wins. Even if that party doesn't, things very differently, doesn't look through the world through my green lens. All right. Now we'll talk a little bit about that because green goes sour here as well. Yeah. Also, to document the truth, this factuality of Orange needs us to work together. There's never one person that does investigative journalism. There's never one person that, does great science discoveries that increase our well-being. It's always people working together. Now, green can deform in our world, of course, as well. And it's, first of all, green is very naive because it thinks that the world is full of good-intentioned people. It's very blind to those that are not good intentions towards them. So, a red values-driven terrorist may want to kill people, and green may not be able to understand that. Right? I've seen, social workers in some of the, we've worked with projects in the Netherlands in neighborhoods that were that had social issues going on, and then we would see that that some of the green values social workers just couldn't understand that the boys driven by red values, that they had a certain how to say they would try to manage them with nice words and so on, and they lost all respect from the boys. The boys wanted strict rules, clear rules. The social workers that had a big heart for them, but were very strict and clear to them, they loved them to death. But the social workers that were being soft and tried to, always have a good conversation, never wanted to set any boundaries, those were the ones that they couldn't control the boys in the projects they were doing, and they would sometimes have to run away because the boys were throwing stones at them, for instance. So when green goes sour, it doesn't understand red, but also it can be very destructive towards the blue and the orange layers. It becomes anti-authoritarian. It destroys the structures and the world, and we see quite a bit of this in our Western world at the moment, where there's such a disillusion about what our Western nations are, and we've seen so much go wrong, when it comes to the unjust wars that are being fought in Iraq and Afghanistan and Vietnam and so on. that people have lost all faith in Western leaders, and they've sort of sided with the enemies of the Western leaders, which sometimes are the terrorists or red value-driven leaders in states, right? So that's one way where green gets unhealthy. Another way where green gets unhealthy is because green, in its essence, is about my harmony, me feeling good, and that can become very narcissistic. So my personal freedom may become so important that I don't care about you anymore. We see that. I saw this a lot during COVID times happening, where there is very little solidarity, where it's about, I want to be free to do what I do. And if I infect anybody or anything, I don't really care. I've heard actually people say the very phrase, I don't care about that because I want to be free. So if we, the quality of green that it brings is solidarity. So, a person cannot be free standing alone from the complex freedom that you all described. If it's about, keeping the enemy out, that's a different story. But if it's about creating all these structures that you can have a choice in life, that you can choose your profession, and you can choose the place that you live in the world and all that, there has to be solidarity. There's no way we can do that without. And of course, the negative forms of that, we talked about that. So this is where, if green becomes sour, if green becomes restrictive, it takes away the very structures that allow it to be. Because remember, green can only exist with a healthy blue layer and a healthy orange layer. The hippies started to appear first in those countries where there was a lot of wealth. Excess wealth, and there was a good blue structure of laws and regulations and order. Right. But green can start to take that away, and we see this happen a lot in our Western countries. Another way where we see green become unhealthy is where it enforces itself onto others, right? Where it's enforcing its political correctness. So you can only speak in a certain way, which is fine for people that have incorporated enough green values. But if I'm driven from blue values, I may not care about the pronouns. And then of course I'm very susceptible to somebody telling me, oh, we have a better idea about this. Where before from my blue values, I may still be able to accept gayness. It's just something far away. Now somebody weaponizes me against it, because I don't feel part of that progressive part of my society that tries to enforce me to use certain words or to behave in a certain way or not to say certain things. Okay, so we summarize this. We see freedom to and freedom from at each layer. But what we do see is that, at the bottom of the spiral, at the less complex systems, we see more freedom from, freedom from other tribes. The red level is the freedom from the enemy, from the state as a collective, and in blue, there's still this freedom, from other truths and religious, but it starts to narrow down. And as we look at what the freedom to, or the positive freedom, or the collective freedom, probably the better term to use here, we see that it starts to build on the lower layers, but the freedom gets bigger as we go through the spiral. And in this, the blue layer is pivotal. So anywhere in the world today where there's a reasonably healthy blue layer, it's necessary to protect whatever layers are built on top of that. So those democracies in the world that still have a very strong blue layer, they're stronger to protect their democracies than those democracies where the blue layer has been eroded. And if we specifically look at the US, we see that a lot of what Trump has been doing, especially in this term in office, is to take away the blue layer. right? It is about it is fighting the courts, fighting the governmental institutions, taking away healthcare rights, taking their social rights, and so on, right? And the story is that that system is corrupt. We need to take it away, right? But it's, you know, if you believe in the blue layer and you say that it's corrupt, you don't take the blue layer away, you start to rebuild it. So you start to build a better healthcare system, a better justice system, a better. I'm not saying there were no, there's probably lots of things very wrong in the blue layer in the US and in any of our countries. It is, right? But if we look at it through the spiral lens and we want to maintain, if we want to repair that, and we want to maintain our orange and green definitions of freedom, individual freedom to choose and so on, we have to make sure that that blue layer gets repaired rather than removed. Because everywhere where it's being removed, things fall down. And so the Soviet Union is a great example. If you look at what happened after in 1990, 1991, it was, then, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the whole blue layer was removed. And with the promise that everybody would, that we implement the free market there. But it didn't provide a social layer there, so the whole society collapsed into a red chaos, you could say. And certain, societies where they managed to keep that blue layer, Poland is a good example, but also the Baltic states, there's lots of other places. That's where they found a new definition for the blue layer. I know in Poland, I don't personally know all the experiences in different countries. I know Poland. I know also there the blue layer collapsed. But somehow in the years following that, in the 90s, the Polish people managed to rebuild enough of it to actually build a layer of democracy on that. And it's unstable. We've seen that. Elections going up and down. It's not a done deal in a certain, but it's been enough to join the EU. It's been enough to join NATO, etc. Yeah, if we look specifically at the dynamic between Ukraine and Russia, without going into all the details of why this war is happening, we see that the reasons that Putin is putting forward for people to fight this war is to fight against the Nazis, he fight against gay Europe. He consistently refers to Europe as being gay Europe, and then we see that it's against NATO and so on. So it's a story against something, away there, and he's asking big sacrifices for the Russians to do that. And in my view, if I look through the spiral lens, we see that the story he has is very much a purple-red story. There's some blue available in that. He's playing with religion. There is a court system in Russia, but as my friends, integral friends from Russia tell me, it's a fake blue layer. So the laws are there only there's laws there to say you can't do this against Putin, and that's how the system is used. It's not used to implement individual freedom, basically. Right. And if we look at Ukraine, we see that Ukraine has a different route. There were also periods between 1990 and now where the oligarchs were ruling, and there was a lot of influence for Russia in Ukraine, and there's still a lot of corruption, as we've recently seen surfacing. But at the same time, especially in 2014, Ukraine chose a road of democracy, and the people have been speaking truth to power multiple times since 1990. There was the 2004, the Orange Revolution, the 2014, the Revolution of Dignity. Those are very strong moments where there was defining moments where Orange was speaking loudly to power and saying, we want this democratic route and not an autocratic route, and that they've survived with that, and that's probably that's probably one of the biggest threats to Putin's power, because if it can happen in Ukraine, it can happen in Russia. So we zoom out a little. So that's the dynamic we see there. If we look in the Western nations, And I'm just focusing on the US, but mostly Western Europe, right? Or Europe, or Western Europe. We've seen that, we've lived the longest period in our history in peace. We've never in our history in the Netherlands or Germany or France had lived such a long period without a war on our territory, right? Um, so most people alive today, they don't know what it is to live in a tyranny. Some, in if you go to the Eastern Europe, of course, the memory is much more vivid. But if you go to the west of Europe, that memory is very faint. And we live in extreme comfort, So these layers have provided us with so much comfort, great healthcare systems. And I know there's people suffering in our countries. But if you compare that suffering to other places in the world, it is, without how do I talk about it without diminishing it, but it is, it is less than in most places in the world. And we have all these social structures in place as well to help people. In the Netherlands, most people that are homeless are there because they fell through the cracks of the system, a lot through drug abuse or mental health issues, and that's a bad thing. We should build a better system for that. But still, that's a very small part of our population compared, for instance, to the US or to other countries. The other thing that happens in our countries is that we had these progressive ideas and we forced it upon everybody. So, the Netherlands is a great example of that. We voted for gay marriage, and everybody is enforced to do that. So if you live in a very religious little town, because we still have a Bible Belt with people that are very religious and are seeing being gay as being an illness. But if you are a civil servant that needs to marry people, you're forced to be able to do that, and otherwise you have to resign. Right. So there's a lot of force upon the complex values, upon the less people that think through more conservative lenses. Then we had the 90s that made us think that the free market had won. Soviet Union collapsed, the democracies had won. So we saw that we could solve everything with the free market. And that has led to not only in Eastern Europe to these bad situations there, but in many of the Western countries today, it has led to an inequality of wealth as well. Maybe not as bad as it was under Red Rule, but still, this promise that everybody would live a good life, we can't really fulfill that at the moment when we focus too much on orange. And then we have the yellow problems. We have climate change happening. We have these wars happening. So we are challenged by yellow problems consistently. We don't feel it yet because we live in this comfort. And then at the same time, there's red forces in this world that are working hard to destabilize our countries. So and that leads to this political divide that we see, where we see part of the Western politics, the Trumps, the Le Pens, the Wilders, the Farage, the AfD in Germany, fighting for freedom for our people against some enemy there, right? And part of that is, part of that is fed by authoritarian countries in this world, empires in this world. Russia feeds a lot of that. Has had a big finger into elections. Had a finger into the election of Trump. Brexit was, but also in most of the European parties that we would see as populist or autocratic, somehow had funding from Russia, often very hidden. But if you look at what investigative journalists surface, there's been a big influence there. And on the other side, we have the more progressive thinking people, looking at civil liberties, self-determination. There on that side, you could say that's they're looking for more complex freedom. But one of the things there is that freedom is a complex freedom. So they don't necessarily want to give a Marie Le Pen the freedom to say what she thinks, or he thinks, or Mariana Le Pen, she, right? So there is also, and there's where, that idea about our collective, complex freedom works well if everybody thinks complex. But if people don't think that same way, if they don't accept our acceptance, then they're not accepted. Right? And that brings us to this paradox, the free societies. We create these really, green and orange create these very open societies. But at the same time, they are open very much also for ideas that don't want those open societies to come in and take over. Right? So our Western social democracies, we've left the door wide open, especially in Western Europe, for influence for political democracies. We've seen that we're already in this hybrid war. And we see that autocrats in Western Europe are now trying to use democracy to gain power and destroy democracy. So the big question there is, how do we create these complex societies without where people can still say what they want, but without making them very vulnerable for those people that don't want an open society? So that brings me to the last slide, and that is, so what would be a yellow view of freedom? Right? And I think that's going to be a conversation also. But I'm going to give you some ideas here, and then then I want to bring it to all of you, right? So I think that, from a yellow perspective, first of all, we have to understand these layers, and we have to understand that they are, what's the difference between the basic freedom and the complex freedom, or why is Geert Wilders talking about freedom, and how is that different from a Mandela talking about freedom? And then we see that if we want freedom in a complex society, and the way that you guys express that, right? Realize not everybody may want that, but I think in most of our societies, there's enough, there's a majority of people at least that want that. Also, a lot of people that vote for Trump or Wilders, they also want those freedoms. They may be caught in a certain story about reality. That is, social media gives a fantastic medium to influence people and create alternative realities, right? But I think most of us want that. But how do we create that for every layer in our society? That's one of the big questions. But it's important to realize that we need that complexity. We need that blue layer in there. And so the individual freedom cannot exist without the collective freedom, basically. So in the end, in our complex societies, both of them need to be there: the individual freedom and the collective freedom. But it needs a constant protection against those forces that want to take society back to autocracy. Right? That is one of the lessons Europe is not learning yet quick enough, I think, is that you have a damn good protection against anything that doesn't want that. And I don't know. I think in a lot of systems there we still need to develop, because how do we do that? How do we build an internet that is more factual based without taking people's right for freedom away? Free speech. What does that mean in a world like that, where we do want people to say what they want, but we also want to somehow reflect that or connect that to reality, right? But it's really important I think from a yellow view, we have to set our own red line. We have to be able to defend that with everything that we have. And I have this sense that, if I look at Europe these days, that those countries that seem to be sort of at that were the first to develop orange and green values, they may not be the first ones to develop yellow values. If I look at Eastern Europe, and the ideas, the politicians there, they have often, and also the Alexander Stubb in Finland, some of the Baltic states, but also Poland, they often have a much more real idea about what's happening in Europe, and also how to protect their freedom. So maybe those are the first places where yellow may start to emerge, but who knows? I don't know. Good. So my last slide here is, what lessons do Berlin, Snyder, and Spalding teach us about freedom? And what, if anything, what, if anything, do you take away from tonight's salon, from what we've been discussing? I'll put those questions in a chat as well, so you can review them there. Anybody? So you can put up your hand if you want to speak, right?
I see that there was a question in the chat.
Okay. A certain degree of freedom is offered. Citizens who come. Freedom is offered citizens who comply to the rules in the red system. What is the difference? Okay. Yeah. So what's the difference in freedom that people experience within the blue and within the red system? So it's an interesting one, right? So in the red system, the truth shifts, right? So the truth is whatever the ruler tells you. So today it's this truth. If the ruler decides that it's something different tomorrow, then you all have to follow that truth. Actually, Russia operates very much like that at the moment. But that's the way that it's always, that's how dictators operate. So, and then if the dictator dies or somehow gets toppled, there is a fight and there is a new ruler and there will be new rules. In the blue system, the head of state is there to serve the truth. So the king is there to, it's interesting. The British king is there to serve God basically and to serve the people. Right? The Pope is there to serve the system, but not for himself. So in a blue system, the ruler, it's not the whip the whip of the day that sort of determines what happens, but it's the truth book that determines that. So you can read it, you can read it in the Bible or in the manuscript or in the laws and regulations. And when the ruler dies, the next ruler comes. So you could say the Soviet Union for a while operated that way. So and China, there's a lot of red in that as well, but also in China that sort of operates that way, and there is more structure and there's more of a truth there. Hélène, please.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's a pleasure
Hi.
to be here with you. So yeah, thank you for the presentation. What arises for me is actually related to your final statement about where you predict yellow, like stabilized yellow nations or nations that yellow might emerge. And I found that interesting because I've sometimes heard people refer to the Scandinavian countries as being emerging yellow, or various parts of Northern Europe, perhaps the Netherlands, etc. So it was interesting to hear your thoughts on that matter. And I notice curiosity about whether you're willing to elaborate on that a little bit. I know it was your final point, and if it's too divergent, that's fine.
Okay. Well, Don came to the Netherlands in 2004, 2005, and he would, he would say that yellow will develop first here because at that time we were experiencing the first populist politicians, and we had a politician getting shot dead. What was the first sort of anti-migration, very populist, with a very populist agenda. But he was also the first one who broke the green values barrier of being able to mention some of the problems that migration was causing in our country and so on. And he
Yes.
thought that we would be the first. But history has so far proven him wrong in the sense that we see that our politics is yo-yoing and it's actually very right wing still, even with the last election. And honestly, I don't have an idea.
Yeah.
I don't know what will happen,
Yes.
because things are so volatile in many of our countries. But I do see that it's very hard for the Dutch people to get out of their comfort zone to start realizing what's happening in Europe. Whereas people in Eastern Europe who also, most of them live in democracies and also in relative comfort, but they still have this memory in their society, in the whole system of what it is to live under autocracy. And so they are much more defiant against those forces within their countries as they are in some of the Western countries. And so I don't put my money on the Dutch being first in that. I do see in some of the social projects that there's a lot of yellow thinking developing here. But if I then look at what's happening in Ukraine as far as how they are self-organizing, that started in 2014. When Russia first invaded, the army wasn't really ready, but a lot of civilians stepped in and they provided, they started to provide the support that the government couldn't give. And still, there's a lot of self-organization happening in Ukraine, and I'm sure that is triggering some yellow development socially within the structures of the country. But at the same time, there's of course heavy, also red and blue values there, and so we don't know really. But yeah, just more of a provocative statement than that. I believe that that's the only truth, right?
Yeah, yeah. Might I add something just kind of related to my own work? Is it okay? I'm not sure if there are other people waiting to comment. I want to be mindful.
Yeah, go on.
Sure. So, part of what came up for me as I was listening to now speak about the subject of immigration is that one of the projects I'm working on is the Eritrean Ethiopian Peace Initiative. So, as some of you know, my family is from Eritrea. I'm American. I grew up in the U.S., but my family's from Eritrea. And I mean, even if you asked me probably 15 years ago, I had what I would consider to be a very green perspective about the importance of multiculturalism and initiatives that foster inclusion. And I absolutely still think those things are very important. And particularly, you can see the impact of the erosion of various programs that existed in the Nordic countries or Scandinavian countries like Sweden, where as those public services were destroyed, there was a sharp increase in crime from various immigrant populations, crime and drug trafficking and all of that, with East African, North African, sometimes Balkan, people from Balkan countries, etc. So I'm not minimizing the importance of those programs. But one of the things that people often refer to, particularly those who like to engage in the culture wars, is the idea that fundamentally there's a mismatch. And of course, they would argue that some cultures are inferior and others are superior, and there's no way to integrate peacefully. And I obviously, from a spiral dynamics perspective, don't concur. But there is a really critical, I think, emergent yellow piece here around this conflict that exists, this anti-immigrant backlash that we are seeing taking over the West in general, and even various developing countries, which is acknowledging the truth. So instead of sweeping it away and saying, oh, we just need to be more accepting, like actually sitting with the complexities and acknowledging that even when there is relative social and economic stability in those countries, the trauma and the imprints of the places where those immigrant populations came from are still very much present. And simply giving people various tools that they need to feel, to have like external security is not sufficient. And talking about what does it actually mean to have a multicultural society, and actually do people have to conform in some ways or adapt, right? And actually let go of whatever old paradigms that they had. So anyway, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent. I do see some hands up, but this was really interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Very shortly to respond to that, I think that, certainly um, a yellow response would be first to look at factuality, because there's, in the Netherlands, there's lots of lies around what immigration does to us and what it doesn't do to us, right? So there is like, if we would stop all the immigrants in the Netherlands, we would very soon be bankrupt, basically. Our society would stop functioning. So there's a truth there, but there's, yeah, we have to look at the truths, the facts, but then we have to go through the layers, right? And we have to see, so what is necessary at each layer to do things. And we've seen in the Netherlands a lot of regressive response from red blue to, suppressing issues rather than looking at the complexity of it and helping people to progress through the spiral. And it, in our country, basically it comes down to small groups needing complex help. And that's not what the anti-immigration people provide. In fact, when they get to power, they don't do a lot, because it, if you start to implement the laws that they are advocating, you're actually destroying the countries more than you help them. So, anti-immigration politicians may see a problem, but mostly don't have the solutions. And yeah, we need a yellow view, and for each country that looks quite different. Thanks. Christina, please.
Yes, thank you.
Before you stop, Rasa, could you go through the comments and see if there's any questions there that need to addressing? No,
yes.
Okay.
Yes, I would see a couple.
Thanks. Christina, please.
Yes, actually, this very much ties into Ellen's question that she just posed, but kind of coming from another perspective. I'm in Germany, and here we kind of have a different problem, or I'm experiencing a different problem than the one that you mentioned, where you talk about a very right-wing movement. What I tend to see is that the German population, I'm not German myself, so I'm looking at it with an outsider's eyes. They have really received a lot of training from childhood up into being very tolerant, very into multiculturalism, very pro-inclusion, to the point that sometimes I have the feeling it is hard for them to accept or to even acknowledge or to see that someone may have a different sort of intent when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, to the point that what you hear louder and louder from people who are exhausted from supporting Ukraine is, why don't they just let the Russians take the land, and they're all going to be fine. They were all the same. Russians aren't different. They'll be fine. We'll be fine. We'll all have peace if we just give the Russians what they want. And, and then if you say, but the Russians, they kind of want Ukraine without Ukrainians, they say, no, you're being intolerant. So that's what I'm running up against. What would be your suggestion for dealing with this particular kind of situation?
Well, I mean, so through the lens, what you're describing is, I think, a mixture of green values response, right? So I worked together with one of our friends from Ukraine. We did a training at the beginning of the war for the nonviolent communication community, because they were all saying, "Oh, let's just do nonviolent communication, and then the war will be solved." Right? Things don't work that way in the real world. I mean, I did a lot of nonviolent communication with Marshall Rosenberg, but we were practicing that in a retreat in the mountains, under perfect green conditions, not under red conditions. So it's about life conditions. So these ideas work green IDs work with green life conditions, red IDs work with red life conditions. In our complex, in our yellow life conditions, we need a different view, of course. So, um, um, and then and another part of that response is from more red values, where it's often greatly dominated by misinformation about what the reality of the situation is. One of my best friends still believes that there's lots of Nazis in Ukraine. If you study Ukraine, if you talk to the people, if you go there, if you really study it, you see that's there are more Nazis in the Dutch parliament and the German parliament than there are in the Ukrainian parliament, right? That's a factuality. So, but if people get caught in these stories that, especially around the more red values driven politicians, they have very strong stories around what their truth is, and it's very different from the factuality. That's a real issue, and I think I don't have a solution for it in the sense that I want our internet to be open and free, but I also know that it's a tool for people to create alternative realities. How do you deal with that? I want free speech to be free, and other than we can make a very clear statement saying, well, if you wish somebody dead, that's not free speech, but as long as you don't hurt people, then that's free speech. But if free speech means I'm going to tell this lie over and over again enough for people to believe it, how do you deal with that? I don't really know, but that's where we have to find a response. And I think, and what I see in the German politics, as far as I'm aware, but others here will probably have a better idea, is that there's also there's a link between the two. There's the old DDR communist parties. Wagenknecht is sort of red green, the Linke. So there's a whole there's these bubbles of belief systems. But we have that in the Netherlands too, right? It's not so much around Ukraine and Russia, but in the Netherlands there is this whole belief system around what happens in the Middle East. There's basically the pro-Palestines, which basically are anti-Israel, and then we have the pro-Israel, and that's the two flavors we get in politics. Nobody talks about the real dynamics, the value system analysis, seeing that there is extremists on both sides and things like that. If life gets complex, it gets very hard for politics to create a narrative around it. But that's where we're at. So I don't have a solution for it, but I see it happen too. And for us to sit here tonight and to analyze that is, for me, one step. But I do realize that doesn't reach the people that may need it, or may need to get out of their stories. But
Well, it's helpful to know that we're not alone with our concerns.
No, it's there, and I think one of the things is, once in a while I can't help myself and respond on social media to things specifically, around Geert Wilders here in the Netherlands. And I always when I do that, I try to connect to the fact that the people that follow him are caught in a story that is not beneficial to themselves. So, but because when it comes down, I know I have a on a campsite, I have this house, and our neighbor there, he votes Geert Wilders, and he's a great guy. He's really friendly. I love this guy. Politically, we think totally opposites, but at the same time, when we're there, if middle of the night I need something and I need his help, I can wake him up, and he's there to help always, right? So, and vice versa. So there is. So how do you speak to the different value systems in a way that you can relate to each other, and you can actually look at what common ground you have? I think that's not really done a lot in our politics, but yeah.
No, this is why I liked so much what Elin said before, because I think what politicians end up leaving us to choose from is politicians that deny there's a problem at all and say you're racist and discriminatory if you even mention something that you're living, that's your part of your lived experience, or you are really racist and against everyone and against migration, and those are two poor choices, really.
Yeah, and so we can disagree with somebody that votes for Trump, but we don't have to call him a racist or a Nazi.
Unless he is.
That's where we can look at Trump.
Sometimes they are.
We can look at Trump and analyze him, and we can see that certain people with Nazi sympathies may follow him. But I'm sure that America is full of people that have absolutely that probably, aren't as racist as they appear as well, but they're just, they're your friends from the campsite that helps you out with things.
That's
And
the
I think that's
nuance
where, but
that we lack in social media. You know that about your friend because you know him personally. And I
yeah,
think when we have contact in person with people, it's much easier to
yeah,
grasp that nuance.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I see another question from Leif, Sweden. Can a citizen experience freedom in a red system with a red ruler?
As long as you agree with the ruler, there's nothing wrong with that, right? So if that ruler does things that you agree with, and then why not, right? So I think that if you look in Russia, there's lots of Russians that agree with what Putin does, and so he's probably their best leader. Although there is nuance there to make, and that's, if we look at it from a distance from the complexity, we think that a different ruler could probably do, that Russian that votes for him or that agrees with him may not necessarily, he may not do the things in the interest of that person, right? But that's an extreme case, especially right now with the war going. But if many people live in autocracies, okay, because they don't speak up and they're okay. Right? There are many people in China that don't involve themselves in politics and they live happily within that system, right? Anything else?
And I question I see from Ben, and I see there's a conversation happening in the chat already, but I will read it to you so you can just tell us what
Well,
you
maybe
think.
Ben wants
So
to
it goes.
chip in.
I'm sorry.
Maybe Ben wants to chip in, or
Oh yeah, Ben, if you would like to.
Oh, I've chipped in the chat. I
Go
don't
ahead.
need to
Otherwise,
okay, you
Nice
want
to see
to
you.
do that here too?
Well,
Please.
I'm just advocating with a little bit of inquiry now and then, but I'm fine, thanks.
Okay.
read it.
Yeah, or summarize it as much as you can. Yeah.
Oh, there's a question about the structures, which says, democracy ruled by the majority will likely not foster yellow governance simply because the center of gravity of people's values are not yellow, nor are governance structures set up for yellow. Structure influences behavior. What structures will promote, support yellow behaviors?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Because if we look at the most complex countries, we do this. Paul Sauker and a friend do this research every time we have an election, and I'm participating in it now. So what we do is we look at all the political parties, we create a values expression of that party, how much of each of the value systems is in there, put a percentage to that, and because we have a clear voting system with no, not with districts or anything like that, just you can vote for a political party, and we have multi-party system, we get a pretty good picture of what the Netherlands, as far as values, looks like, right? And the majority in the Netherlands is still, or the biggest system is still the blue system, right? So whereas everybody sees us as this green country, or maybe people think we're a little bit yellow, or we're very orange. There's a lot of blue. And yeah, so how do you do that, right? I don't know. I don't know how this change is going to happen, because we see that we have yellow problems. We know we need yellow thinking. We see that it's not happening. My God, I don't know. I wish I'd had that wisdom, but you know as well, Ben, right? So it's yeah. I mean, how do we do that, right? So how do we? But the interesting thing is that, so even though even when in the Netherlands the dominant systems was blue, red, and purple, we had our democracies. And this is also this thing that intrigues me, because if I'm a redneck living in sort of in the middle, in the Midwest in the US, right? I'm actually benefiting a lot from the fact that my values may be a red value classes, but I'm benefiting from democracy and all all those things that the more complex systems bring. And I'm participating in a voting system, right? So I don't think the majority of people in a country have to be orange values driven for a democracy to emerge. It just has to be enough in power for it to emerge. But then what do? I don't know. Right? How do we start to include some yellow understanding in a political domain that's dominated by red, blue, and orange, and a little bit of green? I have no idea. I see Europe, Alexander Stubbs in Europe, for instance. I find him one of the most yellow voices. He is a president of Finland. And, if you get any chance to listen to what he's saying, and I think he really, I don't know if he knows power dynamics, but he understands the value system. He knows how to talk to Trump. He knows how to talk to green values, to all the different value systems. He's very clear in that. A leader like that may propose solutions that are attractive enough for all the value systems to choose. Right.
Another question I see from Lee.
Yeah.
Is violence the utter basis for freedom for every democracy?
Could you say that again?
Is violence the utter basis for freedom for every democracy?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I know that our freedom in Europe is fought for, and it's built on lots of sacrifice. And I don't know, in an ideal world that wouldn't be necessary, but we don't live in an ideal world, right? So if we want to build a complex world, somewhere around this pivotal point around blue, we have to defeat red. We have to create enough blue structure to stop red from doing what it does, and we have to always be prepared to use force to stop red. I used to be, in the 80s, I was a pacifist. I didn't want to go in the army. I didn't believe in any of that. That's changed a lot in my life because I've seen that, I do believe that, if you look at this model, if you look at this, that freedom from is a condition to have freedom to, right? So we have to be able to stop those that want to impose one idea about freedom in order to create freedom that is collective. So we have always been able to use, and I think Europe has to use a lot of force now to stop, basically to stop Russia to take over. It's my strong belief, and I don't think we do enough. And it's not, I'm in no way a violent person as far as I know, but yeah, I don't see how we can do it differently. Yeah. I didn't know, red doesn't, if you look at the 28-point negotiation or the plan that's there now, it's so clear that from a red values perspective, there is no negotiation. There's only negotiations are seen in a way to manipulate the others to get what I want. There are never negotiations, from blue onwards, we can start negotiate where, I give you something, you give me something. Right? But in red, that's not there, because if the world is a chaos and with only the strong survive, then I'll have to be the strongest person. And if I get an opportunity, I kill you. I don't play with you. I don't let you exist. So from that perspective, there can never be a negotiation unless, somebody's on their knees and there's no other way around. But even then, we do see that those leaders, they don't negotiate. Saddam Hussein thought that he could take on the U.S. Army. That's another thing in red. We have this greatly inflated sense of ourselves, and we not necessarily very realistic. John, please.
I guess I'm noticing some thoughts about it's one thing to talk about the value systems, and of course we always do, and it's absolutely right to do so. But I'm also looking at something about the life conditions and the stresses that people are under, because I've I guess one of the things that went through my mind was that in the wars in the Balkans, there were people who had been neighbors for maybe, decades or centuries, and who were happy and tolerant of that until the life conditions changed and the leadership changed to one which was power dominant and which started to manipulate the perception of life conditions, such that people who had been living tolerantly with one another suddenly became enemies, or not suddenly, but rapidly became enemies. And there's something about the health of any system that when the system is not stressed, that people actually, by and large, most people don't want to fight each other. They just want to get along. They want to have a life. And there's something about the nature of the life conditions that it can take any of our systems and drive them kind of downwards into either maybe drive healthy blue downwards into red, or it can drive any of the systems into their unhealthy forms. And so I guess one of the things that comes out of that for me, and that I'm just sort of following this train of thought through, is that there is so much about our world right now which is massively stressful. And it's creating economic stress, ecological stress, political stress, ecological stress, all of those things are happening at the same time. And that is driving everybody into more and more into these places where the conflicts are, they're fostered because of the internal tensions. They're fostered because of because people's coping strategies are breaking down. And that, for me, I think is maybe part of, the reason we can't see solutions, the reason why yellow isn't on the horizon to any significant extent, is because the life conditions of 8 billion people on this planet actually does not support it to exist.
Yeah, could be true. I don't really know how to respond to that, or if I would need to really respond to that. But yeah,
well, it's just a point of view, and
yeah,
you're welcome to respond. But I wasn't. I mean, I didn't raise it in a question, so if it's okay, if that's. All.
Thanks for putting that in. Yeah. Elen?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So two things emerged. One is that when you were speaking about red and the way that it tends to view those who, or the way it tends to engage those who it perceives as enemies, immediately the image of Zoran Mamdani with Donald Trump from a few days ago emerged. Like I immediately saw that because many people were blown away by that interaction. And of course there are many potential reasons, including, possible frontotemporal dementia in Donald Trump, or, there are many different things that could happen. But my opinion is that Zoran is squarely green, or it doesn't mean that there aren't any other dimensions, but I would place him at green. In terms of his politics and his public persona. But I thought he was very skillful, even just observing the way that he has run his campaign and the way that he's been interacting with many, many different political actors. I think he is just so, so skillful. And for me, I felt profound optimism that a different kind of populism may, as people have been predicting and as the Republicans have been pushing, may emerge in the United States, right? Like that's always been a potentiality, even, before the election. So that's one thing. It's like this idea that if you are very firm in your opinions and you don't pretend that you don't think Donald Trump is a fascist and a despot, like if you are honest with him, and but he also knows that there are things that he stands to gain by cooperating with you, then I think there's a level of respect that you can demand without necessarily utilizing violence. Yeah, so that was one strand that emerged. The other one just escaped my mind, so perhaps I'll chime in later. Thanks.
I also have to think about the governor of California. I forgot his name, but he's quite a different strategy, I guess. But still, he
Gavin Newsom.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, he's certainly taking on Trump on his own methods, right? So because one of the things that we miss in this polarized society is that the purple orange green generally doesn't know how to speak to people driven from more purple or red or blue values, and I think that's what we really need. And yeah, he's doing that. Schwarzenegger, by the way, is also has been he's although he's a Republican, he's very much concerned about climate change and so on. And he's been putting out some videos where I think that's the sort of guy that can speak to the different value systems. But we need people like that, certainly. Yeah. And I actually think Alexander Stubb also has that, but he doesn't demonstrate it as much. But I think behind the scene, he's doing a lot of that. So.
Yep.
Any other thoughts about this right now?
Yes, I have a thought. So I do not purport to have the solution to how we help foster or how we will usher in, the yellow renaissance. So I'm absolutely not saying that. But what I am saying is that it's really clear, I think, to many of us that technology in particular has been deployed to advance this unholy trinity of blue, orange, and red in the United States and in other Western democracies, and spread tremendous amounts of misinformation and polarization, but that it can also be utilized by the masses. And a lot of those tools are being built and have been built this year by people who are saying enough. And I would say the majority of those initiatives are their center of gravity is green, but yet I'm still optimistic that there will continue to be tremendous resistance utilizing the same tools that companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, et cetera, are building. That it doesn't have to be like some, transhuman techno-fascist dystopia. So those are my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, you bring up this, like the social media obviously is a dream for anybody that wants to create an alternative reality, right? So it's so easy, and I've seen it, and it doesn't just happen to people driven from red values. I've been part of, like spiritual communities that have gone totally berserk, far away from reality, in lots of conspiracy theories and things like that, So how do we, what systems, what blue systems do we need to build from a yellow perspective to protect ourselves against that, right? Because if we come back to my neighbor at the campsite, we are concerned about similar things. He's not concerned about climate change. I am, but when it comes to the Netherlands, our local environment, we're concerned about the same things. And it's probably a bit arrogant of me to think of, but he really believes a lot of stories which I know not to be true. And obviously, I may be misinformed, but I think generally, I some of these items I've followed scientists and so on, so I do think I am a little bit better informed. But how do I make him see that? Right? There's these structures that are building in the Netherlands, but only in a very, very small scale, and it's where they get 100 people in, there's this like a local issue they need to decide on. They get 100 people in the room, and they make sure that those 100 people are from all the different levels of, the different political backgrounds. So representative for what the local politics are, and then they present the problem. They say, we have to solve this issue. What do you think? And then they start by letting them meet all the specialists on that and letting them talk to them. So they get really well informed on all the aspects of that. And then they have conversations around that. And it seems to work really well to create solutions that work for all the people there. But it's done on a very small scale. And but it's interesting, so that when you get people with the real information of the people and the specialists that are involved with whatever the topic is, and you inform them really well, and you let them then discuss, then ideological differences tend to go on the back foot, and they tend to find high quality solutions for difficult issues. Christina, sorry.
Yeah, yes. I just want to say I'm really glad to hear that, because one of the first things I learned about when we bought a little home in Scheveningen in The Hague, which I love, and one of the first things that my neighbors informed me about is that if I was going to be living part-time in Holland, I need to know about the polder mentality. Oh. And that reminds me of what you just said, this idea of really talking a long time until you have a consensus between a group of people, and then everyone is really behind the decision that's made. And I feel like whatever its flaws, we can't seem to get anywhere close to that in our other polarized countries. So I'm glad to hear that there's some version of it that works on a small scale.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the polder model from the Netherlands is, we used to be a trading nation. And so our livelihood depended not on farming or anything like that, but it depended on trading. And that's how we got very, very rich, by exploiting plenty of countries and colonies everywhere. But at the same time, because we were traveling so much, it made us, the tolerance that we have for other beliefs and so on, is just good business. So it's part of our trading mentality. It's not necessarily part of the green in the Netherlands. So of course, it was a good basis to develop green upon. But at the same time, a lot of the poldering is done from self-interest. So that is, and sometimes it works, but it's, I just don't want that to have too much of a positive. Yeah. Elaine, is your hand still up, or do you have another question or saying something to say? Oh no. Okay, good. It's always interesting, right? To look at your own country through the lens of Spiral, because you see how certain mentalities have developed and so on. And yeah, so, and another reason why the Dutch had to where they call it polder model, is because we were living on small islands and we had to keep the water out. So you have to work together to do that. And then we were somehow tolerant toward the religions. So we got, refugees fleeing here from, a lot of Jews fled to the Netherlands from different areas. But yeah. Okay. So how about we close our session for tonight? So thank you all for being here, and I'll be posting the recording of this, and if you feel like any other interactions, we'll post this on the Spiral Dynamics Facebook group, the Graves group, and so on, so we can have further conversations there if anybody's interested. And otherwise, thank you very much for being here tonight and hanging in here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Auke.